London, 1840s. The fog lay thick on the cobbled streets, curling in tendrils around the gas lamps that hissed faintly in the night. The marketplace had not yet opened its stalls for fruit, fish, and cloth, but already there was movement, a gathering of people drawn not by the scent of baked bread or the cry of a fishmonger, but by something far more grotesque, far more peculiar. A whisper had spread through the alleys and taverns the night before: a wife would be sold at dawn. The very words had a morbid pull, a magnet for the curious and the cruel alike. Men who had staggered from gin houses, their faces red and eyes watery, stumbled into the square to secure a place at the front. Women, some covering their mouths in shock, others pretending disgust while unable to resist the lure of spectacle, huddled together at the edges. Children darted between the legs of adults, eager to see what was promised to be a performance unlike any puppet show or street fight. It was the kind of story they would repeat in whispers for weeks, with embellishments to make it darker still. And then, through the thickening crowd, he appeared. A man, hard-faced and broad-shouldered, gripping in his fist a frayed rope. At the end of that rope walked a woman, her eyes cast downward, her hands clenched tightly together as if by sheer force she could hold her dignity intact. The rope was looped over her shoulders and around her waist, crudely tied, as though she were nothing more than livestock. Some in the crowd chuckled, nudging each other at the absurdity of it. Others fell silent, uneasy, for the truth beneath the spectacle pressed down heavily. The woman was not a performer, nor a criminal, but a wife, paraded to be rid of like an unwanted mule. The man tugged her forward and barked for people to make way. His boots struck the cobblestones with the heavy, deliberate gait of someone who knew he was about to cause a sensation. He reached the center of the square and stopped, yanking the rope so the woman stumbled beside him. Then, raising his voice above the murmuring crowd, he declared, "I am here to sell this woman, my lawful wife, to any man with coin in his pocket and desire in his heart." Gasps rippled through the audience. A few men laughed aloud, slapping their thighs at the shamelessness of it. One boy shouted, "What'll you take for her, mister?" "A penny and my dog," earning himself a cuff on the ear from his mother. The wife stood still, her face pale but strangely calm. She did not cry, she did not beg, she did not resist. She knew well enough that tears in this place would only feed the crowd's appetite. Instead, she stood like a statue, the only movement the faint tremor of her fingers as they twisted together. To the modern eye, such a sight would seem unthinkable, an act of barbarism performed openly under the weak sun. But in those days, in the tightly bound coils of Victorian society, divorce was a luxury reserved for dukes and lords, men with fortunes who could afford the endless fees and bribes of courts. For the poor laborer who drank away half his wages in gin, for the coal miner who spent his life hunched in darkness, for the farmer whose back was bent by the plow, divorce was an impossible dream. A man who no longer wished to keep his wife, or a woman desperate to escape her husband's cruelty, had no lawful road to freedom. And so a grotesque practice arose, whispered from town to town: sell the wife in the marketplace, before witnesses, with money exchanged and the rope transferred, and call it final. It was not legal in the eyes of the crown, but for the poor it became a custom, a loophole shaped from desperation and ignorance. And so men treated it as law enough. To them, the rope was a symbol, just as cattle were passed from hand to hand with halters, so too a wife could be handed to another man. Once sold, she was no longer their burden. In the crowd that morning, the mix of emotions was palpable. Some were thrilled to witness the scandal. "Better than a hanging," one man muttered, elbowing his companion. Others turned their faces away, uneasy, ashamed of their own curiosity. A preacher in the corner clutched his Bible but said nothing, for he knew his voice would be drowned out by jeers. And then there were those who watched the wife herself, noting the strange composure in her posture, the slight tilt of her chin as though she refused to let her spirit be entirely broken. The husband lifted his arm and shouted again, "Who will start the bidding?" She is 25 years of age, a fair cook, and strong enough to carry a pail of water up 3 flights without complaint. She has given me no children, and I've no further use for her. Who will take her off my hands? Laughter erupted, followed by silence as the weight of his words hung in the air. The wife turned her head ever so slightly, her eyes scanning the crowd. For a moment, her gaze met that of a young farmer at the edge of the square. His cap was pulled low, his hands rough and calloused from work, but his eyes were fixed on her with something startling, compassion. He knew her name. He had seen her before, hanging washing behind the cottage on the edge of the fields. He had heard the drunken shouting from her husband's door on Saturday nights, had watched her hurry to market with bruises hidden under her sleeves. And though he had never spoken more than a polite word, he carried a quiet ache whenever he thought of her. The farmer's breath caught in his throat as the husband announced the price. 1 shilling and a pint of ale. He bellowed, holding up a tarnished coin for all to see. That is all I ask. A fair bargain for a strong woman. The crowd erupted again, some scoffing at the insultingly low price, others roaring with laughter at the absurdity. A few coins jingled in pockets as men half-joked about making an offer. But the farmer stepped forward, his boots crunching against the stone, his hand reaching into his pocket where a single coin rested, warm from the press of his palm. He held it up high so the husband could see. The murmurs fell to a hush. All eyes shifted from the husband to the farmer, from the farmer to the wife, and back again. A strange tension crackled in the air. This was no jest. This was no prank. A real transaction was about to be made, binding in the minds of all who stood witness. The wife's lips parted slightly, and for the first time her composure wavered, her eyes glistened with a flicker of something dangerous and fragile, hope. The farmer stepped closer, placed the shilling firmly into the husband's calloused hand, and without hesitation handed him a tankard of ale he had purchased from a nearby stall. The husband grinned, sloppy and triumphant, and downed the ale in a single swig. Then, with the ceremony of a tradesman finalizing a deal, he thrust the rope into the farmer's grasp. The crowd cheered, jeered, and shouted in disbelief, some clapping, others shaking their heads. But the farmer did not take the rope. Instead, he untied it carefully, his fingers trembling, and let it fall to the ground. He turned to the woman and, with a voice low but steady, said, "You needn't wear this again." For a heartbeat, the square fell silent. The husband belched and staggered away, already drunk with victory and ale. The wife stood rooted to the spot, the rope at her feet, the farmer's words echoing in her ears. The crowd shifted uncertainly, sensing that something far larger, far heavier than mere entertainment had just unfolded before them. That was the spectacle of the marketplace wife sale. It was more than cruelty, more than humiliation, it was the desperate attempt of the poor to claw some semblance of freedom from a world that offered them none. And though the crowd dispersed, muttering and laughing. Though the gas lamps flickered as the fog returned, the image lingered, a woman no longer bound by rope, her fate changed not by law or court, but by the grim theater of a public sale. It was a scene repeated across towns and villages, each time as strange and horrific as the last. And yet, in that small corner of London, on that damp morning, it revealed everything: the law's indifference, society's cruelty, and the flickering possibility that even in humiliation, a moment of humanity could emerge. The crowd that had gathered in Oxford's Market Square that morning was larger than usual, for word of a wife's sale travelled fast. Gossip moved through taverns and workhouses quicker than smoke rising from chimneys, and by the time Thomas Hardy, a coal-stained laborer with rough hands and a bitter jawline, dragged his wife Mary into the open square, nearly every villager had pressed forward to witness the scene. Men stood on barrels, children dangled from their fathers' shoulders, and women pulled their shawls tighter, some muttering that it was shameful, others straining for a better look. It was an event both scandalous and irresistible. Mary's halter cut into the soft skin of her neck as Thomas tugged her forward. The rope, stained with old grime, looped crudely around her shoulders, dragging her like an animal. Yet she did not resist. Her back was straight, her eyes fixed on the cobblestones beneath her feet. Every step echoed like a hammer in her chest, but she would not stumble. She had stumbled enough in the years with Thomas, through his drunken rages, his fists, and the endless nights where she lay awake waiting for him to crash through the door with ale on his breath and curses spilling from his lips. Today, humiliation was lighter than those blows. Today was the promise of release. Thomas stopped at the center of the square, planting his feet wide, puffing out his chest as though proud of what he was about to do. He shoved Mary forward, displaying her like a farmer might display a mule at fair. "Here she is," he shouted, his voice rough, carrying across the hushed crowd. "My wife of 7 years. A fair worker, good with washing, keeps the fire burning. No brats to claim as mine, no debts on her head. She's sound in body, and I'll sell her now to any man with coin." The crowd erupted into noise. Laughter rang out, crude jokes flung from one mouth to another. One man shouted, "Does she come with a frying pan?" Another called, "You'll throw in the broom, won't you?" Their wives smacked their arms in scolding, but even some of the women tittered nervously. The sheer audacity of it, the shamelessness, sent ripples of fascination through them all. Mary lifted her gaze briefly. She scanned the crowd, her face calm, but inside her heart hammered. She felt their eyes pierce her, the men weighing her like livestock, the women whispering judgments, the children staring with wide, curious eyes. She had prepared herself for this moment, had imagined it in her head through sleepless nights. Yet standing here, the reality was harsher, colder. Still, she clung to one fragile thought: if he sells me, I am free. Thomas, enjoying the attention, swaggered a step forward. He waved a tankard high above his head. "All I ask is 1 shilling, he roared, "and a pint of ale to wet my throat." He spat into the dirt, satisfied with his bargain. The audacity of such a low price shocked some, amused others. A murmur passed through the crowd, and a few coins flashed in hands, though most men only laughed and shoved one another, daring someone to step forward. At the edge of the square, John, a farmer of 30 with broad shoulders and hands hardened by years of plowing, stood silent. His cap shaded his eyes, but his gaze was fixed firmly on Mary. He knew her. Not well, only in glimpses, in passing nods when their paths crossed at market or on the dusty lane. He had seen her hanging laundry in the bitter cold, her face drawn and weary. He had seen the bruises, faint but unmistakable, on her wrists and cheek when Thomas dragged her through town. He had longed to speak, to offer help, but what could he do? A man's wife was his property. The law gave no room for interference. And yet, in the quiet of his own heart, John carried a tender ache each time he thought of her, wishing her life were different. Now, seeing her roped and displayed, the ache burned hotter. Her calmness was not submission, he realized. It was the silence of a soul beaten so long it had learned to endure. But he also saw something else, a flicker, faint as a candle in wind. When her eyes passed over the crowd, they lingered, just for a breath, on him. His chest tightened. He read the plea she could not voice. Thomas swayed slightly, the early morning drink already fogging his mind. He laughed at his own joke, pulling Mary roughly by the ropes as she stumbled. "Come now. 1 shilling. You'll not find a better bargain. Who'll have her?" The crowd jeered and pressed closer, but no one stepped forward. Some were tempted, no doubt, but feared the scandal, the responsibility. Others were only there to watch, to laugh. The silence that followed stretched, awkward and heavy. Thomas grew irritated. He cursed and shook the rope. "Are you all cowards? She's sound, worth more than I ask. I'll not take her back home, by God, I'll sleep in the ditch before I drag her to my bed again." That was when John stepped forward. His boots struck the cobblestones with steady rhythm, the sound cutting through the chatter. The crowd turned, craning to see who dared. John reached into his pocket and drew out a single coin, a shilling polished by the warmth of his hand. He held it up so all could see, his face solemn, unflinching. Gasps rippled through the square. The laughter faltered. This was no jest now. The game had teeth. Thomas's eyes widened, then gleamed with greedy triumph. He thrust out his hand, grinning like a victor. "Well then, a real man among cowards. Pay up, farmer, and she's yours." John placed the coin into Thomas's palm with deliberate calm. Then, from the satchel slung across his shoulder, he produced a tankard of ale, purchased quietly from a tavern just before dawn, as if some part of him had already known what he might do today. He set it firmly in Thomas's other hand. The crowd buzzed in disbelief, whispers darting like birds in a storm. Thomas roared with laughter, downed the ale in one swallow, and slapped John on the shoulder. "Done. She's yours now. May she give you better cheer than she gave me." With a flourish, he shoved the rope into John's hand. But John did not grip it. He stared at it for a moment, then at Mary. Slowly, carefully, he loosened the knot, his large fingers gentle where Thomas's had been cruel. The rope fell away and coiled on the ground like a discarded snake. The crowd held its breath. Mary lifted her hand to her shoulder where the rope had rubbed raw skin. She looked at John, astonishment flickering in her eyes. "You needn't wear this again," John said, his voice quiet but firm. Silence spread over the square like a blanket. The jeers died. Even the children stopped fidgeting. Something in John's words, in the simple dignity of the act, stilled them all. Mary's lips parted, her breath catching. For the first time in years. Tears pressed at her eyes, not of fear or pain, but of release. She swallowed hard, lifting her chin, meeting John's gaze with a mix of wonder and disbelief. Thomas, meanwhile, staggered back, drunk on ale and pride. "She's yours, farmer," he barked, waving the empty tankard. "Do what you will. I've washed my hands of her." He turned and pushed through the crowd, already calling for more drink. Laughter followed him, but it was mocking now, sharp-edged, for the crowd saw in John's act a nobility that cast Thomas's cruelty in harsher light. Mary stood rooted, her wrists trembling, the rope at her feet like a symbol of chains broken. John did not touch her. He only inclined his head slightly, as if to say the choice was hers now. A choice she had been denied for so long. She hesitated, the weight of years pressing heavy on her shoulders. Then, slowly, she stepped toward him. Not as property passed from one man to another, but as a woman choosing the hand held out to her. The crowd stirred, whispers flying. Some smiled softly, touched despite themselves. Others shook their heads, muttering about impropriety, about scandal. But none could deny they had witnessed something rare, something that made the morning's grotesque spectacle into something else entirely, a deliverance. As the square emptied and people drifted back to their lives, the image lingered, the rope abandoned in the dirt, the farmer and the wife walking side by side into a future uncertain but freer than the past. For Mary, each step was lighter than the last.